Our next speaker is Stuart Cowell. He's going to be sharing conservation management's experience working with 3 different Indigenous communities within Australia and talking about the application of the conservation standards or an adaptation of that. So over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Mariana. That was really terrific and incredibly relevant for a lot of work that we're doing, and I think a lot of work that everyone's doing. So great to hear that, and you'll be hearing from us, I reckon. I'm just going to put my timer on so that I can anticipate when Catherine's going to ring the bell. So also thanks to CMP for the opportunity to talk. Saras Kumar was also going to join, I think, as I mentioned earlier, but she's unwell, so you've got me. Some of you will have met Saras. And finally, I really want to commend CMP for the bilingual tool. It's tremendous seeing that in action, so thanks very much. All right, I'll pop my, let's see, share screen. I'm very excited to be getting some PowerPoint done very early in the morning. That's terrific. It's the perfect way to start the day. Breakfast of champions, as they say. So, yes, my name's Stuart Cowell. I work with conservation management. I'm based in Tasmania, at the bottom of Australia, otherwise known by Aboriginal people as Lutruwita, and that's increasingly happening here in Tasmania. It's a renaming or dual naming, which is terrific. I just want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of Lutruwita, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the Muwinina people who are the traditional custodians of this land. And that sort of paying respect is a very common way of starting meetings now in Australia, which is terrific. Just acknowledging the longer history of the land on which we live and work. So I'm going to, as Catherine said, I'm going to talk about our use of healthy country planning, and I'm going to talk about a very specific part of that, which is the MERI, monitoring, evaluation, reporting and improvement, and sort of more or less the step 4 of conservation standards, and how we've been working with different communities to do that. And so looking at three different examples. Very briefly, conservation management, we're a for-profit organisation, but we are mission driven and operate as what's called a social enterprise. So we are for profit, but we use that profit for our purpose, and so focus on supporting conservation standards, healthy country planning and various other processes, working with communities in Australia and elsewhere. As I say, what we're really talking about today, I've jumped too many things. No, I haven't. So one of the things I want to talk about briefly is what we mean by country, just because I know that in the past I've often launched straight into talking about healthy country planning. So in the Australian context, the word country has a particular meaning that is increasingly recognised. So for us, country doesn't mean nation. Country is an Australian Indigenous term that refers, as is in this statement by Deborah Bird-Rose. So, and I'll just read it out. So people talk about country in the same way that they would about a person. They speak to country, sing to country, visit country, worry about country, feel sorry for country and long for country. So it's not a place, it's a living entity with a yesterday, today and tomorrow. It includes the people, the values associated with it, the stories about it, the plants, the animals, and so on. So when we talk about healthy country planning or working on country, we're not talking about working in Australia, and we're also not just talking about working on land. There is saltwater country, the ocean, freshwater country, the land, and it encompasses, you know, people, place, and so on. So healthy country planning is a much broader thing than just, you know, conservation planning as we might have traditionally understood it. What do we mean by merry? I don't know how widespread merry is as a term. It's a bit of a tortured history in Australia, but monitoring, evaluation, reporting and improvement. So we've worked with lots of communities to establish healthy country plans. Those plans have been in place for some time. And what I'm going to present to you is 3 models of sort of closing the loop of the conservation standards. And we use a model a bit like this as a broad kind of guide. So, you know, you do the planning down the left-hand side, establish the vision, all the things that you're used to talking about, we're all used to talking about. And then we're talking about the right-hand side of this diagram. How do we work with communities to, you know, go back in the other direction? So, you know, are we doing the things we said we were going to do? Are the changes occurring? You know, are we getting to where we wanted to go? So this is the broad kind of merry model that we use. The stories that I want to tell, let's say there's 3. So one is northwestern Australia, Untitled the Untitled Monitoring and Evaluation Committee, or MEC. It's lands that are wholly owned by the Untitled people. They have pretty much sole governance of that. There are no other, sorry, there's a couple of national parks, but that's by the by. The second example is from Arnhem Land, Wadakin, with the Wakadaka, and I'll explain that when I get there. Again, it's the traditional lands of the Wadakin peoples, wholly theirs. And then the third example is with the Jajawarung, just north of Melbourne in southern Australia, and the Gapagia process. And that's a joint management where the Jajawarung people are working in partnership with the government of the state of Victoria, which is where they are. And the three approaches have some important differences. They have some very significant similarities, but I'll work through each of them and you know, describe them as they are. The way that we've been working with folks is to try and sort of break down the task of taking a plan and, you know, figuring out whether it's working, is to sort of try and define the specific role that these processes have. But the processes need to work in 2 worlds. Often it's referred to as a sort of 2 toolbox approach, using the toolbox that we bring of conservation standards as healthy country planning, and the toolbox that the community bring of their own understanding of how country works, and, you know, whether country's healthy and so on, the indicators that they use, the processes they use to determine that. And we're trying to put those 2 perspectives together to make decisions about whether the healthy country plan or the conservation standards plan is being used, is being effective, and so on. And so we ask, you know, four main questions. So firstly, it's just, you know, is the plan being used? are we using all the different tools? We've gone through a consultative process, lots of community engagement to develop a plan. We want to make sure that that process is being respected and all the different parts of that process are actually being put into play as much as possible. Or if they're not, as Mariana noted, not everything can be done everywhere, then why not, and does it matter? Second thing is the plan itself working? That's ultimately, that's the way we've tended to phrase this, that the plan is there to achieve something. Is it working? Are we getting to where we want it to go? Are we using the best knowledge and approaches from the two different perspectives? So are we using good Western science, non-Indigenous knowledge and practice? Are we using the best knowledge and the right people from within the community? And how do we tell that story so that all the different actors, the different supporters, the community themselves are actually understanding and hearing the story that's being told? So each of these processes are about those four things. Is it being used? Is it working? Are we using the best knowledge? Are we sharing the story as best we can? So the three examples. So the first one is Almond Monitoring and Evaluation Committee. This was the first Healthy Country Plan, the Wunna-Walgumbura Healthy Country Plan, completed in 2009-10. The process started in about 2 years after the completion of that. It started because the committee put a lot of effort into getting the plan done. They wanted to know whether it was working. The UMEC, Almond Monitoring and Evaluation Committee, is made up of a mix of senior Aboriginal people, cultural knowledge holders, and some Western scientists that the community know and trust and respect, but who are also trusted and respected more broadly. That group initially met 2 times a year, and to sit down and look at the plan and consider how it was progressing. It works very well. It's been going now every year for the last 10, nearly 11 years. And over that time, a lot of trust and relationships and respect has been built, such that it's a very sort of engaged conversation as people challenge each other's understanding of whether something is working or not. Is the right evidence being used? Is the right knowledge being used, and so on. What sort of materials do they use? Detailed reports from the team on the ground, remote sensing data, lots of photographs, monitoring data, all the usual things that you would expect to see, as well as survey-based data, survey-based information, and community impressions of how things are going. The group, as I say, meets a couple of times a year. Initially, now it meets once a year. Basically, meets for a week, usually on country. So everybody goes up into the northwest, into the Kimberley. It's pre-COVID, been doing a lot of online stuff, but up into the Kimberley, and sits down with each other for a few days. People come in, make reports. There's lots of conversation, lots of discussion, and then the UMEC makes a final report, which goes then to the community governance. They have a community board, and with recommendations about how the plan is going and whether changes need to be made. A couple of things that we've learnt from the UMEC model. It just takes time. So even though everybody participated in the plan, there's a different level of understanding required, as I'm sure all of you know, when you need to adapt the plan. So there was a lot of learning about what does it mean to actually use and adapt a plan, because that turned out to be a novel concept. Participation has been very consistent, and that's been incredibly important. We've had largely the same group of people for many years, so that's been really useful. By having the conversations and the meetings out in the landscape, that puts more weight on the local community's perspectives, which has been very helpful. But it can be an expensive process to run. So that's UMEC. The second example, which is similar in that it's a group of people, but different in that it doesn't involve external scientists in the committee themselves, is the Wakajaka, or the Gananan Jamak Gamarokme. Hence we call it Wakajaka because that's just easier to deal with. Supports the Wadakan Indigenous Protected Area. So we're in the middle of Arnhem Land in northern Australia. Some of you will have heard of Kakadu National Park. It's quite a well-known national park. So they're just the country to the east. The Wakajaka, as I say, is entirely made up of community leaders supported by monitoring and evaluation staff member, somebody that the community employ to help them do their monitoring and evaluation. But all the decisions and drive is in that community, in the committee themselves. And as they need outside input, they seek it. So they don't have outside input in the day-to-day. They get that from others as required. So they wanted something which was wholly community driven, without any sense of being driven by external agendas. They looked at other models, looked at other ways that people did that and came up with that. So it's supported by a coordinator, meets a couple of times a year. It's a subcommittee of a board, so the members of that are also members of the larger Indigenous Protected Area board, so they have a lot of authority. That looks at reports and collates reports back to that board. The sort of materials they use. Wadakan have been doing very extensive landholder satisfaction surveys, and so they use a lot of community feedback because people live on their own country, they're working on their own country day by day, doing things on country. The impressions of, and they have been for millennia, their observations are very fundamental to how things are going. So they use extensive community surveys. They run a large-scale monitoring program using remote cameras for small mammals and things like that that are harder to detect, and various other inputs. As I say, meet a couple of times a year, review the data and take recommendations to the board. Probably the key thing we've picked up from the Wakajaka is just the value of those landholder satisfaction surveys. The power of doing that sort of regular, structured social survey in effect, and feeding that back in. It's just been terrific and has really helped us to deal with a number of challenging indicators and targets that don't lend themselves to being measured by traditional means. It's early days for that, but it's going very well. The last model is quite different, and that is again, it's a group of people working to determine whether a particular plan is is it working? Are we doing all the right things? That sort of stuff, and that's with Judge Warung down in Victoria, Gapagia. So Gapagia just means to know, to follow, to ask, to tell. So it's a friendlier term than MERI. Monitoring, evaluation, reporting and improvement helps people to sort of feel a bit more connected to it. The context here is that it's the plan is guiding the management of 6 national parks and conservation areas which are managed jointly between the Aboriginal community and the government. And so in this instance, the two toolboxes are essential because we've got government agencies, protected area management agencies working with community. And so we're trying to operate in a very shared space about the progress of the plan. So the joint management is what's called joint management partners are trying to both keep themselves and each other. There's a little bit of a making sure everything we signed up to is actually happening. So there's a sort of accountability, an important accountability element to this process. It needs to be accessible to both the community and the agencies. So each partner needs to have a good sense of the validity of the process. But also trying to build capacity of the community over time. So that's 20 minutes, I've finished in a moment. So the joint management plan was put in place, and it was widely acknowledged that there needed to be some shared space to be able to track the progress of that plan. For the last 2 years, again, although everybody was involved in the development of the plan, it's fascinating to see how much work it takes to get from that to an agreement about what monitoring and evaluating the plan actually needs and will require. So a lot of the last couple of years have really been about the committee, the team of people working on this, getting together and determining that. At the minute, a lot of the inputs, because it's very early days, are really just simple progress reporting. Do we think things are being done that we said that the plan would do? And the committee are really working through trying to figure out what are the shared indicators of success that might be used for some of the larger goals and objectives. The critical thing here is that we've gone from no shared monitoring, no shared discussion about progress to at least a regular quarterly report now of progress that everybody's joined in on, and building that habit of reporting. Having that go for a couple of years in and of itself is a minor miracle.
Good boy.
Okay, my last point is simply that each of those three models, similar but different. They're all about those four things. Is the plan being used? Is it working? Are we using the best knowledge? How do we tell the story in their own context? UMEC, very much a shared process on country, focused on a healthy country plan. Wakajaka, very much a community-driven process, focused on their healthy country plan. And Gapagia, a shared agency and community process focused on joint management. But all of them anchored in the structures and processes of conservation standards, and all of them about using that structure to help drive people through some sort of decision process to be able to make change and adapt their plans, and to use both knowledge systems in each case to be able to make those decisions. That's it. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stuart. Well, I'm not going to thank you for the homesickness, but everything else, really amazing to have those three different examples and those common lessons coming through there, and also that experience of working obviously with the government and then the local Indigenous communities as well. Any sort of questions for Stuart at this point? Perfect timing, by the way. Well done.
Thank you.
Anybody
just to say quickly that we're just cranking up a new large-scale protected area or predator control program in New Zealand, and we're looking towards Stuart and Pip to be involved in that sort of startup process. So a lot of exchange going on here.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Really, really interesting. Okay. Be keen to hear how that goes. Any other questions? Giselle? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't want to hog the time, but since no one else is asking a question. So Stuart, just amazing. I've just loved these presentations today. And my question to you is kind of like a little bit left field, but in all of these cases, did you ever have people that really resisted the process, and how have they come around? Like, how did you, like, have you kind of built your own little personal toolbox of like helping these groups when they have someone who really resists all of this, process and monitoring and evaluation? I just love your insights.
Thanks, Giselle. It's a good question. To be honest, a lot of the resistance that we bump into is generally bumped into during what I call the sort of planning phase, more than this back end. Only that, there are, as you might expect, people who are, firstly, there's the cultural perspective. This is by using something like conservation standards, it's an imposition of a non-Indigenous framework over people's country and ways of being, and so people push back on that pretty hard. So we do a lot of work to demonstrate that it's about creating a negotiated space, that we're not trying to turn everybody into Western scientists and Western planners or subsume particular cultural perspectives. Similarly, we're not expecting that government agencies are going to function like local communities. And so this is about creating a third space, which is a shared space between the two. And that just by turning up a lot of times and talking through that and working through that tends to help. By the time we get to this merry phase, the sort of monitoring and evaluation phase, those questions are still there, but people are on board because we've got a plan, and typically we've been fortunate that plans tend to attract resources and demonstrate a bit of success, and so there's a bit more support for them. If that resistance continues and it's from senior enough people, we don't get to this stage, to be perfectly honest. It just doesn't, we don't get this far. Mm-hmm. Because it's voluntary and so on, there's no imposition. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Not much of an answer. But...
No, it's good. It's good. It's also about like failures, like how well do people, are people willing to share failures? Like when things don't go right, because I know Americans often have trouble.
No, it's that's a really good point, and that's a lot of it is getting everybody comfortable with saying, "Oh, that's not working," mm-hmm. or we need to do something a bit different. But these are very safe spaces. We spend, in essence, we're creating quite safe spaces. So to allow that to occur, to allow people to say, "Oh, that's not going very well," rather than seeing that as failure, to understand that as simply, "Oh, well, what are we going to do about that?"
Gotcha.
That takes a while, particularly in the joint management space between where we're looking at shared management of government national parks. There's a much keener desire to not talk about failure.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Really great presentation.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Giselle. And one final question, CJ.
Hi, yeah, this is Carol Danberg, and thanks for an amazing presentation as always, Stuart. I sit in Alaska, so the Indigenous aspect of your presentation, of course, is most relevant as well. So my just general question was, are these plans available for us to look at? I'm really interested in the one where you're working with the Indigenous and government overlay, which seems to be a major factor here in Alaska. Thanks again for a great presentation.
No worries. Certainly the underlying joint management plan for the Jajawa run, you can just download that off the interweb. That's a public document. Some of the more detailed Gapagia process ones are not. But if you want to send me an email, and I can ask to get some released and emailed directly to you.
Great, I'm
Great,
sure
thank
that'll
you.
be most useful for quite a few people. Brilliant. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our conservation and practice session. Thank you again to both of our speakers. Really, really interesting talks today. And again, if there's further questions or comments, I'm sure both of the speakers and their colleagues will be happy to answer those. So what we're going to do is brings us to a quick update on our CMP initiatives. So I believe we're stopping the recording now. Is that right, Caroline?
Yes, we can stop the recording, and then anybody who's, I guess the translation team can jump off, but please leave us. And Catherine, you have hosting capabilities, so I think you can keep the meeting going. But a huge thank you to the translation team. This has been great. And then I guess anyone else from CCNet, that kind of ends the technical presentation. You're welcome to stay around for